This is Ethan Tapper, the Chittenden County Forester, and I'm out here in the Maple Shade Town Forest in the area that we mapped in the 2018 Forest Management Plan for the parcel as Stand 3. So a stand is just an area of forest that's similar enough that you manage it as a unit. And so what's special about Stand 3, if you walk in the Maple Shade Town Forest, is that it's dominated by these big, tall white pines. We know from aerial photos of this stand that it is the youngest stand in this portion of the Maple Shade Town Forest, that it was a pasture in the 1960s when the forests around it and some of the other areas we're going to be working in had already been allowed to revert from pasture back into forest. The other thing that's really striking about this stand, Stand 3, is how unhealthy this generation of white pine are. So if you look up, you'll see that they have very small crowns, not a lot of needles on these trees. You'll see that there's a lot of dead trees on the ground that have blown over recently, and you'll see that there's a lot of dead standing trees. This is an example of a forest which is really common in Vermont. So a forest that was a pasture, was allowed to revert back to forest, and it just happens that this one species, white pine, is really, really good at colonizing these old field sites. And so even if it's not really a good place for growing white pine in the long term, these areas will grow a stand of white pine. They're all the same age because they are started at the same time. And they grow into this sort of stand which is often very impressive and has this tall canopy, but is often also very unhealthy. A lot of this field abandonment happened around the same time as it happened here in Stand 3. So in the 1950s and 60s, there were some changes in dairy farming rules, which led a lot of these smaller and more marginal dairy farms to go out of business, and thus their pastures were allowed to revert back to forest land. So now a lot of those old pastures are white pine, which is 60 or 80 years old, growing on these sort of marginal sites, and when we have these big wind events, it starts to fall apart. So here in the Maple Shade Town Forest, we saw this process start to happen in 2017. We saw big areas of this stand start to blow down. This is something which is certainly striking, but is not necessarily a problem. This is how this stand is going to revert from this monoculture of this species, which is really only here because this was an old field, to something more diverse, more complex, more like what a natural forest would have been had it not been cleared for pasture and maintained that way for a long time. And so our job here in Stand 3 is not to clean this stand up. It's not for us to go and pick up all the dead wood that's on the ground and to cut down all the dead standing trees and make it look neat and tidy. It's up to us to sort of embrace this disorderly transition from this young field origin stand to this more diverse, complex, interesting stand. And so what we'll be doing is trying to proactively cut trees, which will be releasing some of the regeneration that's already started to come in as a result of the light created by the 2017 windstorm and the trees that blew over. When we cut trees down, we'll be leaving even more dead wood on the forest floor. This dead wood is a really important part of how our forests work. It helps them form soils and it's really important habitat. So we'll actually be trying to deposit even more dead wood on the forest floor. We'll be leaving dead standing trees, and we'll even be creating some more dead standing trees by girdling. You'll see that some trees are marked with a G. Trees will either be girdled, so just killed but left as dead standing trees, or they'll be dropped and left on the ground. Now, we don't want to just wipe out those white pine trees, which provide different habitats, interesting benefits to the forest. What we're going to do instead is retain some of them. So some of these we're going to leave. They'll just probably blow over and become deadwood on the forest floor, which is great. Some of these trees you'll see marked with an L, and that L stands for legacy tree. And the idea of leaving these legacy trees is that these are trees that will be retained in perpetuity, not for their timber value, but just for their ecological value. So if we go through and we cut every big tree in the woods, we will not have the many ecological benefits of big trees, which I'll talk about in a future video. So the job of these legacy trees is just to be big trees, to provide habitat, and eventually to become big dead trees. And so if you come out here to Stand 3 at the Maple Shade Town Forest, you'll see us facilitating this disorderly transition from this young field origin stand to a more diverse, more complex, more interesting forest.